Yeah, our CBS News partners revealing some new GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, tracking the movements of the boat Nolan Wells was on before he disappeared July.
There are now two completely different stories about what Nolan Wells said in the last conversation anyone had with him, and they cannot both be true. One version comes from a young woman named Katie who says Wells told her he was heading back to get on the boat with his friends. The other version comes from those same friends who say Wells told them he was staying behind to spend more time with Katie. Somebody's account of Nolan Wells' final words is wrong, and that single contradiction is now sitting at the center of a case that's been referred to a grand jury. Before we get into what a grand jury actually does with a contradiction like this, you need to understand exactly what each side has said, who's saying it, and why neither account has been able to stand on its own so far. That's where we're starting today. Katie's identity became public after Cajun Navy Incident Commander Josh Gill said in a video statement that Wells had been with a young woman on the island before he disappeared. That single detail, that Wells wasn't alone in his final known hours, immediately became one of the most scrutinized facts in the entire case because it meant there was a specific named person who had spoken with him after his friends say they lost track of him. Katie's mother, Gracie McCormick, confirmed on Facebook that her daughter had in fact been with Wells that day. McCormick also said Katie has been in contact with the Wells family since Nolan's disappearance became public, which matters because it establishes that this isn't a second-hand rumor. Katie has been in direct communication with the people who have the most at stake in getting her account right. At the same time, McCormick has been careful to draw a boundary around what her daughter actually knows, and that boundary is worth sitting with before anyone jumps to conclusions. She said plainly that Katie has no insight into what happened to Wells after the two of them parted ways. That's an important distinction, legally and practically. Katie is not presenting herself as a witness to Nolan's disappearance. She's only accounting for one specific thing, what Wells told her he intended to do in the conversation they had before he was last seen. Anyone treating Katie as someone who might know what physically happened to Wells is going beyond what she or her mother have actually claimed. Within that narrow scope, though, her account is specific and significant. According to attorney Ben Crump, Katie told the family that Wells said he was going back to get on the boat with, in Crump's own phrasing, the boys. That's not a vague impression or a second-hand summary. It's a direct, first-person account of what Wells told her in his own words shortly before he vanished. If that account holds up, it means Wells' own stated intention, as of that conversation, was to leave the island with his friends, not to stay behind. And that creates an immediate, obvious problem. If Wells intended to leave with the group, something has to explain why the boat ultimately left without him. It's also worth noting what Katie's account does not resolve. It tells us what Wells said he planned to do. It doesn't tell us why that plan didn't happen, whether he changed his mind, got delayed, was prevented from reaching the boat in time, or something else entirely. A stated intention isn't the same as a completed action, and in any investigation, the gap between what someone says they're going to do and what actually happens next is exactly the kind of gap investigators have to fill in with other evidence. Right now, nobody has fully filled in that gap, which is precisely why the competing account from Wells's friends carries so much weight. Set against Katie's account is a version that says essentially the opposite. According to Crump, Wells's friends have told the family that Wells said he was going to stay behind and spend time with Katie rather than get back on the boat with the group. This isn't a single vague claim. Multiple friends have independently offered versions consistent with this account. One of them, Traceston Shepard, told Good Morning America that Wells wanted to stay behind because he'd met a girl he liked, adding that it seemed like Wells genuinely liked her. That's a specific human explanation, not just he stayed, but a stated reason why, rooted in an observation about how Wells was acting that day. Separately, Wells's best friend Javon Williams gave the Biloxi Sun-Herald his own account of that afternoon. Williams said he last saw Wells after 4 p.m., that Wells was hanging out with a girl and other friends at that point, and, notably, that both he and Wells had left their phones on the boat that day. That last detail matters beyond just the timeline because it offers an alternative, mundane explanation for why Wells was separated from his phone. If Williams's account is accurate, leaving phones on the boat wasn't unusual or suspicious behavior specific to Wells. It was just something more than one of them did that day for ordinary reasons having nothing to do with anyone's disappearance. So here's the actual shape of the contradiction stated as plainly as possible. Katie says Wells told her his plan was to leave with the group. The friends say Wells told her his plan was to stay with Katie. Both of these can't be accurate descriptions of the exact same moment in time unless Wells changed his mind at some point between the two conversations, which is entirely possible. People change plans constantly, but which nobody involved has actually claimed happened. Nobody on either side has said he told me one thing, then later told someone else something different because his plans changed. The two accounts are simply presented as competing static versions of what he intended, with no bridge between them. Crump has pointed to this exact gap publicly, saying the two accounts simply don't line up with each other. Wells's parents have said essentially the same thing in their own words, that it's unclear who's telling the full and accurate story, and that they've heard two mutually exclusive accounts of their son's final hours, with no clear way yet to determine which is accurate. It would be easy to write this off as the kind of fog that surrounds any chaotic group outing. People remember conversations differently. Timelines get fuzzy, especially after a tragedy makes everyone replay the day looking for missed warning signs. But there's a reason this particular contradiction has become central to the investigation rather than a footnote, and it comes down to basic witness credibility analysis, which is something investigators and eventually a grand jury will have to apply directly to this case. When two sets of witnesses give directly conflicting accounts of the same conversation and neither account can be independently verified, the question stops being what happened and it becomes who is more credible and why. That determination isn't made in a vacuum. Investigators look at things like, does a witness have a motive to shade their account in a particular direction? Is a witness's story internally consistent or does it shift over time? Does any part of a witness's account line up with physical evidence that doesn't depend on anyone's memory? In this case, Wells's friends have an obvious incentive to describe an account where Wells voluntarily chose to stay behind, because that version doesn't require any explanation of what they might have done differently. Katie, by contrast, has comparatively little at stake in how this contradiction resolves. She's not one of the people who left the island without Wells, and her mother has been fairly conservative in her public statements, mostly confirming facts rather than pushing an interpretation. None of that means Katie's account is automatically more trustworthy. Credibility isn't determined by who has less motive to lie, it's determined by the totality of evidence. But it does explain why investigators can't simply average the two accounts together or treat this as an unresolvable he said, she said. If this case moves toward any kind of charge, a defense attorney and a prosecutor would each build their arguments differently depending on which account they can support with independent evidence. That's exactly why physical, time-stamped evidence, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone's memory of a 5-minute conversation on a crowded beach, has become so important to this case. And that's exactly what the GPS data is now being examined to help close this gap. Before we get to the GPS analysis specifically, it's worth remembering there's already one piece of hard, time-stamped evidence in this case: the recorded distress call NBC News obtained through a records request. On that recording, the operator of the boat carrying some of Wells's friends can be heard telling a dispatcher, "We're sinking. Can you all please come?" after the boat's bilge pump failed while leaving Horn Island. That call was made to a private towing company, not to 911, and it was made around 4 p.m., which lines up closely with the time frame Javon Williams gave for when he last saw Wells, hanging out with Katie and other friends. That overlap matters because it means the boat's mechanical problem, the reason the friends give for why they had to leave when they did, is independently confirmed by a time-stamped recording, not just by their own recollection. That's a meaningful point in favor of at least part of the friend's account. The boat really was in trouble around that time, and that part is not in dispute. What the audio does not do is confirm anything about Wells specifically, where he was standing, what he'd said to whom, or why he wasn't on the boat when it left. It confirms the boat's mechanical problem happened and roughly when. It says nothing about the Katie contradiction one way or the other. This is a good example of the broader pattern running through this entire case. The physical evidence recovered so far tends to confirm the parts of the story that were never really in dispute, while leaving the actual point of disagreement, what Wells said, what he intended, and why he wasn't with the group, completely untouched. That's exactly the gap that GPS data is now being examined to help close, and it's worth understanding what that kind of evidence can and can't actually do before we get into it. It's worth briefly separating out the phone issue from the Katie contradiction because the two get conflated online, but are legally distinct problems. Wells's phone was recovered by his family, not directly by police, and his mother has said that after going through his Snapchat and other accounts, she found no saved photos or videos from the day of the trip, which she and Wells's father have called suspicious since Wells regularly documented social gatherings. Separately, the family has raised concerns that content may have been deleted from the phone itself, a claim serious enough that attorneys for the family are now reportedly working directly with investigators on a forensic examination of the device. That issue, whatever it ultimately shows, is about what happened. What GPS data cannot do, no matter how precise it is resolve the Katie contradiction directly. Location data records where a boat was, not what two teenagers said to each other in a conversation on the beach. Even a GPS timeline that perfectly matches the friend's account of when they left doesn't tell us whether Wells told Katie he intended to leave with them or told the group he intended to stay with her, because that conversation happened on land, not on the boat, and no GPS unit was tracking Wells personally. So the honest, precise way to describe what this evidence can do is this. It can confirm or undermine the surrounding facts each side has built their account around, timing, location, sequence of events, without directly telling us which version of Wells' final words is true. That's still valuable. A witness whose account is contradicted by independent GPS data has a much weaker position going forward than one whose account the data happens to support. None of what we've covered so far, Katie's account, the friend's account, the audio, the GPS data, actually resolves how Wells died, and it's worth being clear that these are two separate tracks of the same investigation. Investigators have said drowning is suspected, and Jackson County's coroner has pointed to the well-documented strong currents on that stretch of Horn Island as a plausible explanation for how someone ends up in the water and doesn't make it back. Crump has challenged that theory directly, arguing Wells was an athlete and a strong swimmer, not the kind of person who typically drowns in familiar coastal water. Neither of those arguments has been resolved, and neither one depends on which version of Wells' final words is true. That's an important thing to hold on to as this case moves forward. Even if the GPS data eventually settles the timeline question, and even if investigators eventually determine which account of Wells' final words was accurate, none of that automatically tells us how he died or whether anyone bears legal responsibility for it. Cause of death is a separate medical question, currently sitting with two parallel efforts: the state's completed autopsy, still awaiting toxicology results, and the independent autopsy the family commissioned, now underway in Washington, D.C., reportedly funded in part by Colin Kaepernick. Two autopsies running in parallel means two separate medical findings that will eventually need to be reconciled publicly, whatever they show. So think of this case as running on two tracks that eventually feed into the same place. One track is about what happened in the hour before Wells was left behind, the Katie contradiction, the friend's account, the GPS data. The other track is about what happened to his body once he was in the water, the drowning theory, the two autopsies, the pending toxicology results. Both tracks matter to a grand jury because both go to the same underlying question. Was this a tragic accident, or does the evidence support that someone bears responsibility for what happened? This is where all of it converges. Crump and the Wells family met with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath, and Crump described the meeting afterward as respectful. According to Crump, the DA's office confirmed that Wells's case will be turned over to a grand jury once the sheriff's office completes its investigation. The DA's office has told NBC News that this is standard procedure in any case involving an undetermined cause of death, and by itself isn't a signal that a crime occurred, a point worth repeating clearly because a grand jury referral in cases like this is routine, not an accusation against anyone. It's worth explaining generally what a grand jury actually does, because a lot of public discussion about this case treats grand jury as though it automatically means charges are coming. It doesn't. A grand jury's job is to review the evidence investigators have gathered and decide whether there's enough to support formal charges against a specific person, a standard usually described as probable cause, which is a meaningfully lower bar than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required to actually convict someone at trial. A grand jury can also decide the evidence doesn't support charging anyone at all, in which case no indictment is issued and the case may remain open or effectively close, depending on whether new evidence surfaces later. Applied to this case specifically, that means the grand jury will eventually have all of this in front of it at once. Katie's account of what Wells said, the friend's contradicting account, Javon Williams' timeline, the recorded distress call, the GPS data once it's fully analyzed, the phone's forensic review, the disputed video and voice claim, and both autopsy findings once complete. The grand jury's job isn't to decide which witness seems more sympathetic or which family's version of events is easier to believe emotionally. It's to look at whether, taken together, that evidence supports probable cause that a specific person committed a specific crime. Contradictions like the Katie versus friends account don't get ignored in that process. They get weighed directly, often becoming exactly the kind of thing prosecutors and grand jurors spend the most time on, because resolving which account is more credible can be the difference between an indictment and no charges at all. Right now, none of that has happened yet. No charges have been filed. No one has been named a suspect. The sheriff's investigation is still active. The GPS analysis hasn't been publicly finalized, and both autopsies are still pending. What has changed concretely is that this case now has a defined legal pathway: sheriff's investigation, then grand jury review, rather than sitting in the more open-ended, undefined status it had in the first days after Wells's body was found. That's a real development, even without a single new fact about what actually happened to him. One more thing worth addressing directly, because it's shaped so much of the public conversation around this case, is the sheer volume of outside pressure surrounding it. The Mississippi State Conference of the NAACP formally demanded the release of law enforcement records, witness statements, video evidence, and autopsy findings once complete, framing transparency as an obligation owed to the family rather than a courtesy. Sheriff John Ledbetter, for his part, has publicly asked the public to stop spreading unverified information while the investigation continues, a standard request in any case where online speculation is moving faster than the evidence itself. It's worth being honest about what that kind of public pressure can and can't actually do. It can affect how quickly information gets released, how much scrutiny investigators face if they appear to move slowly, and how much political cost there is to handling the case poorly. What it cannot do is lower the legal bar a grand jury needs before charging anyone. Probable cause is probable cause regardless of how many people are watching, how much media coverage a case receives, or how strongly a family or the public feels that something doesn't add up. A grand jury weighing the Katie contradiction, the GPS data, and everything else in this case isn't operating with a different standard because of the national attention. The attention just means more people will be watching to see whether that standard gets applied consistently. That distinction matters here specifically because so much of the online conversation around Katie's account versus the friend's account has already treated one side as obviously credible and the other as obviously covering something up, often before any of the physical evidence has actually been analyzed. That's an understandable reaction to a case this emotionally charged, but it's not how this contradiction is likely to actually get resolved. It gets resolved the way these things always do. Slowly, through forensic analysis of the evidence that doesn't depend on anyone's memory, and eventually through a formal proceeding designed specifically to weigh conflicting accounts against whatever hard evidence exists to test them. Before we close out, it's worth stepping back from the legal analysis for a moment, because underneath every piece of evidence we've walked through today is a family that has lost their son, and a group of other families now living under intense public scrutiny during what would already be one of the hardest periods of their lives. Christine and Elmore Wansley have said plainly that they're still grieving, that it hasn't even been that long since their son was found, and that they're trying to protect their family and hold on to some sense of peace while all of this plays out in public. That's not a small thing to ask of anyone, to process the loss of a child while also fielding contradictory accounts, media requests, and a case moving to a grand jury all at the same time. If you've ever lost a child, a sibling, a close friend, or anyone whose absence reshaped your daily life, you probably know that grief like that doesn't wait for an investigation to finish. It doesn't pause while GPS data gets analyzed, or while two competing witness accounts get sorted out. The Wells family is living that reality right now, in real time, in front of a national audience. And so, in a much quieter way, are the families of the friends who were on that boat, some of whom have said they've received threats simply being connected to this case. None of them chose to have their grief or their fear made public property. That's worth remembering every time this case shows up in your feed. It's also worth remembering that this isn't a rare story, even if the national attention on it is unusual. Families lose children under unclear circumstances more often than most of us think about, and most of those cases never get a civil rights attorney, a national news cycle, or a grand jury referral. Nolan Wells' case has resources and visibility behind it that most grieving families never get access to, and that imbalance is itself something worth sitting with, regardless of how this particular case resolves. So here's what I want to ask you directly. Looking at everything we've covered today, the sheriff's early no-foul play comment, the pace of the toxicology results, how the friends' accounts were gathered, how Katie and her mother have been treated publicly, and the request for unedited video, is there a specific point where you think this could have been handled differently? Not who's guilty of what, because that's not something any of us can determine from the outside. I mean the process itself, the communication with the family, the speed of releasing information, how witnesses were approached, how the public was looped in. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which specific moment in this timeline you'd have handled differently, and how you think cases like this, a young person's death, a grieving family, conflicting witness accounts, and this much public attention should actually be managed by investigators going forward. I read these, and some of the best perspective on cases like this doesn't come from legal analysts. It comes from people who've lived through losing someone under circumstances that were never fully explained. That's the legal state of play as of today. The moment the GPS analysis is finalized, the phone's forensic review comes back, or the grand jury process formally begins, this case moves again, and we'll be back with exactly what it means. Subscribe so you don't miss it.